In the last video, we explained some of those fundamental concepts that are found in the Upanishads that deal with fundamental questions about individual existence. We studied karma, samsara, and moksha, and we saw that the ultimate goal, moksha, the liberation from samsara, has to do with somehow escaping from this cycle that we find ourselves in due to the system of rewards and punishments for our actions known as karma. Now, generally what you find in the Upanishads are suggestions that the way in which we can make spiritual progress and eventually attain moksha has to do with a kind of wisdom, a kind of knowledge. However, much of what you see in the Upanishads suggests that the kind of wisdom that we must attain in order to somehow break free from samsara isn't necessarily a wisdom that can be conceptualized. In other words, it's not just a bunch of facts that we can know and explain to others and write down on a piece of paper. Instead, the wisdom that the Upanishads speak of tends to be more of an experiential wisdom, right? It's something that you experience, not necessarily something that you can fully grasp or conceptualize in the way that we grasp and conceptualize various pieces of information. It is a kind of wisdom that you kind of know from deep within you, and you experience it in a very rich way that allows for this kind of escape from the notion of samsara. And generally what we find in the Upanishads, that the fundamental feature at the heart of this sort of experiential wisdom that will transform ourselves, allowing us to break free from samsara, is the relationship between Atman and Brahman. So here we have two more Sanskrit terms that we need to get really comfortable with if we are going to understand the basics of Hinduism, especially the basics surrounding the quest for liberation and the structure of salvation that is put forth in the Upanishads that will really remain dominant to this very day. So it's about this kind of wisdom between Atman and Brahman. That's what we see highlighted in the Upanishads. So Atman is simply the soul, right? And of course, we're thinking here primarily of human beings, so we can refer to it as the human soul. I have, in a sense, my Atman. In a better sense, I am my Atman, right? My soul. That's who I am. Clearly, if we think about the notion of karma and samsara, I am not to be identified with my body, right? Because this body will eventually face some sort of death, and it's my soul, my Atman, that will then continue in another body, assuming that I don't reach liberation between now and then. So the soul is what continues. The soul, in this sense, is eternal. It is what continues lifetime after lifetime. The body comes and goes, right? This body is here for now. Another body will take its place. Sometimes throughout Hinduism, we get bodies described in some ways almost as changes of clothes, right? This is the clothing that I am in right now that my Atman is in, but at some point my Atman will take off these clothes and put on new clothes, a new body, as I continue my journey through the cycle of samsara in search of moksha. So the Atman throughout the Upanishads is described as eternal, indestructible, right? That which does not die, that which is not born, that which continues. In a sense, it always has existed and always will exist. Right now, our Atmans are working their way through the cycle of samsara, right? But ultimately, the goal is for our Atmans, our souls, we, who we are, to escape that cycle and to experience moksha, whatever that ends up looking like, right? So the idea is we have to figure out the relationship between our Atmans, our souls, and Brahman, right? Now, Brahman is one of the most difficult concepts to try to make sense of throughout all of Hinduism, but especially here in the Upanishads. Brahman sometimes is thought of, especially by Westerners, as God. But I'm not sure that's ever really a great translation for Brahman, because God, especially to Western ears, those ears that are more familiar with Judaism or Christianity or Islam, is a personal divine being most often, right? Certainly there have been philosophers and theologians who try to move away from that personality, the notion of God as a noun, and they want to think more of God perhaps as action or verb or freedom or something like that. But for most of us, we think of God as a being, right? A personal being, and therefore we can describe God in some ways. Doesn't mean we can fully grasp God, but we can say certain things about God, perhaps, at least in a metaphorical way. We can talk about various attributes or qualities attached to God. Brahman is not that kind of personal divine being. Brahman, right? I think the best translation would be supreme being, not a supreme being or even the supreme being, but simply supreme being, right? That is being itself, reality itself, right? Not a particular feature of reality, not even necessarily a kind of creator of the rest of reality, but simply reality itself. Brahman, throughout the Upanishads, is sometimes described as something that pervades everything. So in a sense, everything is Brahman because Brahman is reality. And therefore, everything that exists, everything that is Brahman. But at the same time, and a little bit paradoxically, Brahman also transcends everything. So Brahman pervades everything. Everything is Brahman, but in another sense, Brahman transcends everything. Brahman stands over and against everything, even as everything is Brahman, as it is pervasive. Right? Now, this is where I always caution individuals not to assume that I'm lousy at teaching Hinduism because you cannot fully understand what I'm getting at when I'm trying to describe Brahman. Because even in the Upanishads and throughout most of Hindu thinking, Brahman is always seen as something that cannot be fully grasped. Right? Some scholars suggest that Brahman cannot be explained or described any more than infinity can be contained. Right? You cannot contain infinity. Infinity, by definition, goes beyond all efforts at containment. Right? And in the same way, Brahman goes beyond all efforts at description, at explanation. Brahman is without attributes. Right? We don't say Brahman is loving or Brahman is patient or anything like that. Brahman is impersonal. Brahman simply is supreme being. In this way, Brahman is even beyond gender. We don't even use gendered language generally when speaking of Brahman. Brahman is reality itself. It pervades everything and yet transcends everything. So somehow we have to try to experience a wisdom that centers on the relationship between Atman and Brahman. Probably figuring out a little bit right now why this is so incredibly confusing and why Hinduism will teach that very few people will really reach enlightenment or liberation, moksha, in this particular lifetime. This is a very, very long process to eventually achieve this transformative wisdom that one experiences, not that one can conceptualize, but that one experiences between my soul and reality. Right? In other words, you are understanding how your understanding of yourself, how your identity, how your soul fits in to the universe, to reality itself. Right? This is the ultimate answer of all of those questions surrounding individual existence. Who am I in relation to all else that exists? And that question is about the relationship between Atman and Brahman. Right? Now, we will see in a later video that scholars will continue to debate precisely what that relationship is. For centuries and centuries, even to this day, there are Hindu scholars trying to piece together what that relationship ultimately looks like, even though they might admit that they can't fully explain it because it has to be experienced. Right? What's frustrating is that when you read the Upanishads, you see that this transformative wisdom is at the heart of the spiritual quest. And yet the relationship between Atman and Brahman, which is central to this transformative wisdom, is generally only hinted at. There are suggestions about the relationship rather than specifications. Right? Obviously, it would be helpful if the Upanishads simply told us how our Atmans relate to Brahman, supreme being, that which pervades and yet transcends all that exists. Right? In one very famous Upanishad, the Chandogya Upanishad, you have a story to help us think about the relationship between Atman and Brahman. In the story, a father asks his son to dissolve salt in water. Right? Gives him a glass of water, perhaps, puts some salt into it and says, dissolve that salt into the water. So you stir it up to eventually you have the dissolved salt. Right? And the Father then says, you are that, right? In which he means you, the Atman, are, in a sense, Brahman, just as the salt is the water when it is fully dissolved, right? Just as that salt, in a sense, becomes one with the water, you must understand that the true relationship between you, your soul, and all of reality is one of unity, right? That you become one with reality. It's that kind of wisdom, perhaps, the experience of that knowledge that can allow you to then not have to come back again and again as an isolated aspect of reality, which all of us are right now, but instead to recognize the ultimate union of all that exists. And therefore, this transformative wisdom allows us to escape a life of isolation, a life of separation, to simply blend into oneness with all of reality, and therefore to become Brahman, just as the salt becomes the water. You are that. Right? Now, again, this is going to be one of those passages that is debated about for centuries upon centuries, right? We will see later a couple of key Hindu philosophers, Shankara and Ramanuja, who both tackle this passage along with many others in the Upanishads and try to think about that relationship between Atman and Brahman. And they each have their own unique ideas about how to interpret that. For Shankara, as we will see, he believes that Atman and Brahman are identical, right? And the idea that I think of myself as different from you, different from these books, different from everything else that I experience in the universe is simply an illusion. It is false. It is not real. I think that I'm here and that I'm separate from you, but ultimately I have to come to the realization that I am one with everything, that there really isn't even an I in the sense of an isolated I, right? So for Shankara, moksha will be an experience in which, using a metaphor, my Atman as a single drop of water falls into the ocean of Brahman. Well, again, that's confusing. What does that mean for my single drop of water? Well, in one sense, it seems to suggest that that one single drop of water is no longer a single drop of water. It is the ocean in a sense, because the ocean is one, right? So Shankara believed in this radical identity between what we now think of as different realities, different entities. Ramanuja, as we will see, believes that there is an intimate closeness between Atman and Brahman, but there remains a certain level of distinction, even within the overall unity of Brahman. So we'll say more about that when we get to their moment in history. But for now, just think about this structure of liberation that is being formulated. When Hinduism begins with the emergence of the Vedas, these sacred teachings, the source of knowledge, we have that original focus very much on a this worldly experience of happiness and health. Then, eventually, you have individuals pushing for greater knowledge having to do with these larger questions about individual existence. Those questions are posed in the Aranyakas. Some answers are given in the Upanishads about karma and samsara and moksha. And in terms of how to achieve that moksha, the Upanishads focus on this transforming wisdom that is centered on the relationship of my soul and all that exists, Brahman, supreme reality. Right? This is something that we have to reflect on to try to grasp a little bit of what is being meant in these discussions. And hopefully we can even find some Upanishads, read through some of these Upanishads. It's always helpful when studying religions to read those primary texts, to read the sacred text, to try to get a sense of what is going on. So reflect on this a little bit. In the next video, we'll move on from the Vedas, the Shruti texts, that which is heard, to Smriti texts, some other important sacred texts, even though they are not technically on the same level as the Vedas.